Hello, welcome. This week we discuss the era of good feelings. I consider the era of good feelings to go from roughly 1815, when the War of 1812 stopped, and goes until roughly 1824. So called because really the Jeffersonian Republicans were the only party that was dominant during that time. The Federalists had roughly disappeared after that, and so the idea was it's supposed to be an era of good times, of good feelings, because, well, there was really only one a political party out there. Needless to say, it did not last. Obviously, they're going to incorporate other parties and ideas, and there's going to probably be a split within that party. Here's the thing. Two of the biggest issues in that time period, number one, the Missouri Compromise. The Missouri Compromise happened in 1820, which is why it's also referred to as the Compromise of 1820. And the issue was Missouri. Missouri was ready to become a state. And hopefully you will remember that, first of all, any of that land in the West was just federal land, and then it became a territory. A territory is sort of like a starter state, and after it had been a territory for a long enough time, then it became an official state and got a star on the flag. Missouri was a territory and was ready to become a state. Now, the problem with that was there was an even number of slave states and free states. And no matter which way Missouri went, whether it was a free state or a slave state, it was going to disrupt that balance. And already in 1820, there was a lot of infighting, questions about how the political parties and political power should be distributed evenly between the slave states and the free states. So no matter what happened, there was going to be an imbalance. And there was no clear answer because Missouri is sort of on the border of North and South. It borders the southern states, but it also borders Illinois, so what do you do there? There's no clear answer geographically. The answer came in Maine. Maine was also about to be ready to become a state, so they waited and they brought both Missouri and Maine in at the same time. Maine was a free state, Missouri then became a slave state, and they kept that balance. The other part of the Missouri Compromise is they drew a line, basically, and 3630, and they said anything north of that when it comes into the Union and becomes a state will be a free state. Anything south of that will be a free state, or slave state. So they tried to compromise there and solve the problem for all of the future generations. And it does create, a good compromise for a while, for the first, 20 or 30 years after that. But eventually, the Missouri Compromise is nowhere near a solution to the problem of slavery and the infighting for political power that was happening between the North and the South. The other big thing that happened in this time period is the Monroe Doctrine. President Monroe, obviously, was in office when this happened, and it is essentially a foreign policy outline and sort of a shift in foreign policy. In a nutshell, what was happening is all of the Spanish colonies that were in South America and Central America, so think, Venezuela, places like that, they wanted to be independent. They no longer wanted to be Spanish colonies. And a lot of them were fighting Spain in the early 1800s to get their independence. And the United States felt very strongly about that those countries should be independent. And it goes back to the United States having been British colonies at first and now being independent and being on their own. Also, they were concerned that with these new tiny countries that were relatively powerless, that there would be an opportunity for some other European country to come in and try to take them over. And then you'd have new colonies, and They did not want that. So the Monroe Doctrine essentially said no new colonies in North or South America, and basically it told Europe to stay on their side of the ocean, and in return, the United States would stay on ours, and that we would not be involved in European conflicts, which sets up a century, if you will, of more or less isolationism and following that pattern, that we don't get involved in European affairs, and the Europeans don't get involved in our affairs or in the affairs of South America either. So kind of a bold stand there. If it had been tested, if the British, for example, had tried to have a colony in South America, not sure we could have stopped them, but at least the idea was there. The idea was out there. Okay, last but not least, the elections in 1824 and 1828. Two of my favorite elections. In 1824, you had John Quincy Adams, who was the son of the second president, John Adams, against Andrew Jackson. John Quincy Adams is the Jeffersonian Republican. Andrew Jackson is more or less a Democrat. The Democrat Party did not quite exist in 1824, but by the time Andrew Jackson is through, it will exist. Andrew Jackson ran more as the everyday man. He had a reputation for being rough and tumble. He obviously had fought in the War of 1812, had quite the reputation from the Battle of New Orleans in the War of 1812. So people knew who he was, had a reputation for being a hothead as well, had been in more than one duel in his day, had a bullet in his shoulder to prove it. And the election got very nasty. Andrew Jackson went after John Quincy Adams and said he was too rich, too bookish, too privileged. John Quincy Adams said that Andrew Jackson was an adulterer, basically. Andrew Jackson's wife had been married and divorced, and then she married Andrew Jackson, and what John Quincy Adams claimed is that she married Andrew Jackson before her divorce was complete, and as if divorce wasn't a big enough deal back in 1824, to say that he married her before she was officially divorced was even worse. Andrew Jackson's wife died shortly after the election, and he blamed John Quincy Adams for it, saying he put her through too much stress with that campaign and how he handled it. Long story short, Andrew Jackson loses the election. He calls it the, quote, corrupt bargain. Because what happens is there was no official winner in the Electoral College. Neither of them got the requisite majority to win the election. And so Congress got to decide who would win the election. And John Quincy Adams went to Congress and said, hey, vote for me. And he told his friend Henry Clay, if you help me get Congress to vote for me, I will make you Secretary of State. And that is exactly what happened. Henry Clay helped John Quincy Adams get Congress to vote for him, and lo and behold, Henry Clay became Secretary of State. Andrew Jackson was unhappy, was bitter about it for quite some time. However, Andrew Jackson gets his day in the election of 1828, 4 years later. In that election, it's John Quincy Adams versus Andrew Jackson again, and this time Andrew Jackson wins, and the Democrat Party sort of comes into office. So be thinking about all of that. It's a really big time, and Andrew Jackson, when we talk about him and his presidency in the coming weeks, he really does usher in sort of a new era for the United States, one that I am looking forward to talking to you about. Thanks.